Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, in 2020, the Chamber of Commerce endorsed 23 House Democratic contenders, many of whom were in very competitive races. The group endorsed 29 Republicans as well, but its support for nearly as many Democrats made waves in the Beltway. It signaled some change. Now, in the fall of that year, Ryan described the chamber as a long-standing, quote, appendage of the GOP. Per usual, he was right on the money. Literally, in this case, you can see a breakdown of the chamber's spending in these charts from Open Secrets. Now, yesterday, Kevin McCarthy seemed to officially file for divorce from the chamber. Quote, the chamber left the party a long time ago, he told Breitbart, fingering wokeness as the culprit. Note the sequence in McCarthy's language, though. The chamber, quote, left Republicans. And because of changes to their fundraising patterns in the Trump era, Republicans are comfortable and even eager to break up with the chamber. A source connected to GOP leadership told me last night that Democrats endorsed by the chamber in 2020 were, quote, margin makers. In other words, the goal was to give them the House. The chamber implemented, quote, an intentional strategy to elect Democrats, the source said. Now, a combination of reporting and common sense suggests that assessment is accurate. So why is corporate America shifting left to the party that nearly nominated Bernie Sanders in 2016? Well, because that party ultimately nominated Hillary Clinton. But it's the problem of populism that's rendering the chamber potentially irrelevant. The problem of populism for the chamber, that is. I think Democrats legitimately have a serious champagne socialist problem, but I also think, like Republicans, they're having a hard time sort of wrangling their populist strain, which puts an organization like the Chamber of Commerce in a weird position in 2020 and 2022. But maybe it'll all be fine for them. Aaron Wren wrote a pretty brilliant piece for American Affairs, probing why a deep red state like Indiana is not an enclave of personal prosperity, despite espousing all the traditional pieties groups like the Chamber ensured Republicans would enshrine in their platforms and then in their policies. Quote, the Hoosier state has had a Republican governor since Mitch Daniels was elected in 2004, Wren notes. It has been a Republican, quote, trifecta state with GOP majorities in both houses of the legislature since 2011. When Daniels was elected, Indiana's per capita disposable income was only 90.5% of the U.S. average. The governor's top priority was raising the state's lagging incomes. Indeed, Daniels said his administration's, quote, central objective was to raise the disposable income of Hoosiers. His strategy for achieving this was business-centric, focused on, quote, building the best sandbox for businesses to play in. That is very characteristic of Republican rhetoric for decades. And Wren has some reasonably kind words for Daniels. But he also reckons with some cold, hard facts. Here he is with more. When Indiana became a Republican trifecta state, he writes, its average disposable income had actually declined to 89.5% of the national level. By 2019, it had fallen slightly to only 89.4%, and during the pandemic, it dropped to 88.7% in 2020. In short, Republican leadership, under Republican leadership, the state's relative incomes started out low and got even lower. That is to say, the chamber-friendly dogma Republicans have tied themselves to for decades, it's not really feasible alone in the context of deindustrialization and cultural chaos. Deindustrialization hits particular states like Indiana very hard, and the dogma has to, of course, adapt and react to the climate on the ground. So voices on the right and the left are making this point, and as much as the political establishment sympathizes with the chamber, new fundraising mechanisms are rendering them less important than in years past. This isn't to say our political parties are suddenly going to be broadly representative or populist, but it's at least a sign that populism is serious enough to alienate some political forces who are struggling to meet the moment. Republicans seem eager to give up the chamber's support, increasingly aware they can win on culture issues that the chamber doesn't want them to touch. The big question is whether establishment Democrats will pick up right where Republicans left off. Ryan, that's a good question for you. Are establishment Democrats sort of going to eagerly take the baton from the chamber Republicans, and will we now see more and more chamber Democrats?
Well, yeah, and what this does is it illuminates a really fascinating divide within the Democratic elite. I mean, within the Democratic Party, the divide is clear, like you laid out. You've got the Sanders wing, you've got the Clinton wing, but within the elite, Schumer and Pelosi represent kind of divergent responses to the rise of both the Sanders wing and of the resistance. And the resistance was important because they were giving not just $27 to Bernie Sanders, they were giving $50 to every single Senate candidate that Schumer asked them to the point where the lady who lost in Maine badly to Susan Collins lost with like $15 million still in her bank account. And so Schumer looked at that and was like, I don't need this is Wall Street Chuck. Like, that was his nickname throughout his whole career. He's like, I don't actually need Wall Street right now. It is easier for me to raise money from these individual donors and mass that up into the hundreds of millions of dollars than it is to sweat and work for all this Wall Street money. Because there are some caps. They want to do super PACs, which then Schumer can't necessarily control. These are hard dollars that are going, the resistance money is hard dollars going right into the party. When you're courting Wall Street, you've got to be on the phone individually with each one of them. You got to give internships to their little kids, or you got to like do favors for them, and often you have to make policy decisions for them, give them tax breaks, carried interest breaks, private equity breaks, that are then detrimental to you come election time. But you do that because you want their money. So if you can get money and actually do popular things, the thinking goes, then do that instead. Then you have the Pelosi side of it. Pelosi's huge skill has always been at big dollar fundraising. And her whether or not you call her a mentor or not, Representative Burton, whose seat she took over, kind of pioneered big money Democratic fundraising and using that as a way to both advance within the party and also to advance liberal progressive priorities. Over the decades, it has obviously metastasized into what it is now, but that's what she's very good at. And so for her, she's happy to have the chamber's support, even though in 2010 she was calling the chamber basically traitors. Actually, I think actual traitors, because they were taking like money from like the chamber took money from like Indian oligarchs, and Li Fang has reported how they were kind of funneling it then into the United States through a bunch of different vehicles. So they went from calling them actual traitors to now embracing them because this is a big amount of money. And she also likes the politics of it.
Yeah, so I'm reading Molly Ball's fawning biography of Pelosi right now, and there's a fascinating little anecdote about her first run for Congress, at how she was sending out to certain neighborhoods, super like highlighting her support for the LGBT community, and then she was going to the wealthy neighborhoods and sending them leaflets about how she's going to keep their taxes low. And it's this amazing illustration of the Pelosiism, to the extent that it still exists, and it existed all the way back then. And that's the two factors are that, like, now both parties can fundraise differently. They don't have to be as tied to those corporate sponsors. They still are, of course, but they don't have to be as responsive to them. And secondly, I don't think a Mitch Daniels in 2020 would govern the way the Mitch Daniels of the past did, because you can sort of see the evidence playing out in certain states. And when you have Republican candidates talking about occupational licensing reform, and I don't know if Mitch Daniels particularly was a pet issue of his, which by the way is great and important, but when you have them sort of carrying that, waving that flag on their campaign trail and saying what we're going to do is focus on cutting this and this and this, which of course I all support, until the point where it starts to really hurt people. And that's, the evidence is, mounting, and you can look at states like Indiana and the fact that you have conservatives that are saying we need new policies, we need to be less in bed with corporate America, is great. But whether this actually makes a difference, I don't know. I just think the sort of formal divorce from the chamber is an interesting sign of the times.
And who'd have thought the small dollar revolution would have more effect on the Republican Party than the Democratic Party?
Ryan, I am looking forward to what's on your radar next.